Hello, everyone. It's Mr. Huffman, and by the end of today, we're going to be done with the American Revolution. And it's one of those unfortunate things. If we were in class in a regular kind of schedule, I would have went further in depth with a lot of this stuff because a lot of it is important, and there's so many moving parts to it. But being the situation it is, we're going to have to kind of hit fast forward on it a little quicker than I would like. But that is what it is. So the tide turns and the war ends. Kind of last one we talked about how despite the struggles of Valley Forge and despite all these defeats that Washington had suffered, now thanks to the victory at Saratoga, the French are going to get involved. And once the French start to get involved on our side, then that's really going to start to turn the tide of the war and open up a lot of resources and men and all sorts of things that can be used elsewhere throughout the colonies. What about the Western Front, though? So Joseph Brant, I'm not going to say his Native American name there because that's too tough for me to say. Okay. He's going to convince four Iroquois nations to actually join the British and attack Americans. And this was in large part because the Native Americans and the British were making deals and saying, okay, after the war, you can get this land and we'll let you live in peace again. The likelihood that they would have really kept that deal, who knows? But nonetheless, they are going to make promises to the Iroquois to say, hey, if you attack Americans, we'll give you some of your land back. Okay, and that is going to start in July of 1778 when these Iroquois nations attack in western Pennsylvania and kill over 200 militia members, which is kind of a sizable victory at that point. However, they also try to take western New York, but end up losing it. Okay, and this is actually going to kind of be a nail in the coffin in some ways of the lasting power and influence of the Iroquois nation. So ultimately, this was not a good thing. They should have sat on the sidelines because once the Americans turn the tide of the war and start taking the fight back to them, they're going to, again, put a big nail in the coffin of the power and influence of those once mighty, titanic Iroquois nations. Okay, the Cherokee, meanwhile, they're convinced by the Delaware, the Shawnee, and the Mohawk to take on Americans on their own land. Okay, and what's going to happen there is they attack settlers in Virginia, but North Carolina militias kind of show up and are actually too strong, and they're going to then retaliate. So by 1780s, hundreds of Cherokee communities are burned in retaliation. And when we get into kind of really the next kind of 20 or really about 50-ish years of American history, the Cherokee are going to be slipping and slipping and slipping in the Southeast as a regional power because many years before this, they were the Southeast regional power. But because they jumped in and were trying to support the British, once the Americans turn the tide and retaliate, the Cherokee, like the Iroquois a little further north, are going to really be hurt severely. And again, once the United States is kind of fully defeated Britain and we're starting to concentrate and build the United States government from the ground up, a lot of these Native American nations, we're going to remember, hey, you sided with the British against us, and there's going to be, unfortunately, consequences for them that last. So what about the sea, right? Again, Britain's Navy is the best in the world. And so it's really going to be a tall order for America to fight the British Navy in the way that we would really hope or expect to. But Americans, we start small. We first target small merchant ships that damage British trade, all right? So we're not necessarily taking on their biggest kind of cruisers or destroyers head on at first. Instead, we're attacking their small merchant ships, which give them supplies and all that stuff that kind of keep the Navy supplied and running on a daily basis. And once those start to sink, the rest of the British Navy is going to be kind of much tighter and much more thinly spread, right? So that's going to be kind of a key way that America takes the fight to Britain, kind of in small, indirect ways. It's almost like guerrilla warfare on the high seas, right? That we're not attacking them full on, but we're kind of raiding and attacking their smaller merchant ships. Also, letters of marque, those are going to be issued. And what are those? Licenses to private ship owners that authorize them to attack British merchant ships. So sort of like those privateers that I mentioned Britain was using to take on the French and take on the Spanish way, way, way back when, like the 15 and 1600s. Basically, these are basically a lot of basically there. Basically, this is kind of American government, the young American government paying basically pirates to go out and attack these merchant ships. And that's going to cost the British millions of dollars. That's not just in today's money, but even back then, a lot of money. Okay. Very famously, there was the incident of the Bonhomme Richard, okay, which was American naval vessel captained by John Paul Jones, okay. It's going to actually sail very close to the British coast. So again, most of this action of this war is happening all totally in the Americas or off the Atlantic coast, right? But this actually gets pretty close over to the British coast. So we're not just fighting here, we're trying to take the fight over there to Britain. Okay, but again, that's not primarily where it was fought, but it did get close. Okay, so this Bonhomme Richard is nearly sunk, and when asked to surrender, Jones says, "Sir, I have not yet begun to fight," very heroically, very admirably. And the ship again nearly sunk, but they're going to lash back and end up boarding the British Serapis and win the day. So this is a massive victory, naval victory for America, which again, taking on Britain, the greatest naval power in the world, getting close to Britain, and then even kind of boarding their own ship and taking it over. This is a huge win and a huge victory. So again, most of the American Revolution is going to be fought on the ground through combat on the ground. But in some instances, we do kind of take on the British Navy. But again, it wasn't as much head on often. It was mostly through these kind of targeting these small merchant ships, which again was supplying the British Navy with maybe some troops or weapons. Okay. What's going on in the South? That's another big thing, right? As I said, I think last time, the British wanted to disconnect the South, right? They wanted to take New York, separate kind of New England from those southern regions. Okay, so that was a big part of the plan for the British. Also, again, the South, more so a little bit than the North, featured strong loyalist support. So there were people more in the South who were tended to be a little more loyalist. Now, again, there were some patriots in the South, which I'll mention, but on the whole, the South was more prone to be loyalist, okay, which meant that, well, if we separate the South from that radical New England territory, then maybe we can kind of convince them, no, we really do need to stay loyalist, and that we can maybe convert them and have them rise up to take on the troops in the North. So that was the goal, and that was the idea. Also, the South was important because they had a lot of valuable cash crops for the British. Tobacco and rice, those were making a lot of money for the British, so they put a big emphasis on, hey, we need to protect those colonies or those regions, okay? So a lot of battles are going to go on in mostly South Carolina, but some as well in North Carolina. Charlestown, or Charleston in particular, a huge priority, right? That basically in New England, that profitable Boston harbor had been lost, which meant, hey, we need some other massive big harbor where we can get goods in and out of the colonies. Charlestown was the natural kind of choice for that, okay? And on a very famous battle on May 12th of 1780, Americans there are going to surrender after heavy fighting. So Britain is going to take Charlestown, okay? 5,500 prisoners are going to be taken, which is ultimately the worst defeat for America during the war. So we've talked about some other struggles America had, but in terms of kind of tactically, but also in terms of sheer manpower, 5,500 taken prisoner. Again, Charlestown going to be the biggest, really, defeat of America in the war. But the war had been dragging on for some years by this point, and as bad as this defeat was, it wasn't going to be enough to kind of totally change the tide and be in Britain's favor once again. But again, Charlestown, huge priority because, again, all those valuable cash crops, tobacco and rice that Britain was making a lot of money on in the South needed to come or go through a kind of a major port in the South, and Charlestown was that. Now, North Carolina does have kind of a big battle, the Battle of Kings Mountain, okay, and it kind of first has its roots in South Carolina militias, and there's going to be, I mostly talked about patriot militias, but in some cases, especially in the South, there's actually going to be loyalist militias, right? Again, mostly we think of militias as being part of the American or patriotic cause, but in some cases, there were loyalist ones, okay? And patriotic militias are going to take up arms against Patrick Ferguson, who was kind of this regional power down in the South. And in particular, he was loyalist, so he was loyal to the crown, and so he looked all the worse for that. Now, a big turning point is going to happen in the South, though, when more and more farmers are going to start to realize, hey, the British are treating us not so great, and that's going to make them switch over to the patriotic or American side. So at first, the farmers are mostly on the British side or don't even really care. They're not actively campaigning for the British. They just want to keep things the way they are. But they're seeing how harshly people like Patrick Ferguson and other people who are loyal to the British are treating these farmers, that's going to be enough for them to rise up and maybe start to join some of those patriot militias. Okay. General Nathaniel Greene, he's going to really serve as the Continental Commander in the South. And if you've ever seen the movie The Patriot, we're not going to watch it in here. I don't think it's even all that great. But that movie is kind of, Mel Gibson's character is based on a lot of these important people in the South, these kind of militia members. It's kind of an analog or a compilation of a lot of these guys. General Nathaniel Greene and Francis Marion. Francis Marion in particular was known as the Swamp Fox. He was a patriotic militiaman who ran his own little crew. And they're going to do a lot of very damaging hit and run campaigns against British camps and supply wagons. So again, guerrilla warfare in the South. These guys are great at kind of hiding from the British. They know the territory super well, and they're going to be very successful in terms of slowly eroding and slowly damaging that kind of British, that early British kind of momentum that was taking place in the South. They're going to come in and really start to mess with the gears of that, and slowly the South is going to start being more and more patriotic. So again, at first, South a little more loyalist, but over time, thanks to these militiamen, they're going to be converted. And in large part, again, the British were not properly kind of taking care of the farmers there, and so the farmers said, well, we support this kind of American patriotic cause instead of this purely British cause. Okay. Now, this next guy I want to introduce, I'm not even going to have you take really any notes about him, but he is important in a lot of ways for us. Just you've heard about him before, I'm sure. Benedict Arnold. Who was Benedict Arnold? He's kind of known as the greatest traitor in American history. Okay. Born in 1741, originally part of kind of Washington's army. He's an American who is mostly, again, fighting for the patriotic cause at first. And he's going to be successful early on because in 1776, he successfully halts the British invasion of New York at the Battle of Lake Champlain. So he is a war hero of sorts, kind of early on in the war. And he played a crucial role at Saratoga, defeating the British there. And again, Saratoga was important because it got the French on our side. So he played a very crucial role there, but he's going to unfortunately suffer a very serious leg injury. And he's going to turn out to be a pretty bitter guy. He thought of himself as kind of, hey, I'm just as good as Washington. I'm just as good as all these other generals that I'm not necessarily going to go over, but are important. I'm just as important as any of them. I should be having kind of more cachet. I should be making more money. I should have a greater status. And that's it kind of goes in part. He lived a pretty lavish lifestyle, and by that point had acquired a pretty considerable debt. At the same time, his father-in-law, a guy by the name of Edward Shippen IV, actually was kind of a prominent rich guy who harbored a lot of loyalist sympathy. So all these things combined, it should be no real surprise why Benedict Arnold is going to kind of turn to the dark side, so to speak. So at the end of 1779, he's going to negotiate with the British the surrender at the fort at West Point, New York, which is West Point Military Academy, where that's currently located, in return for money, but also in command of kind of a British force or a British army there. So he basically gets, hey, he's kind of turning states, so to speak. He's going over to the British side for money for one thing, but also he gets to command his own army. Now, word of Benedict Arnold's kind of treachery and his behavior is going to make its way, obviously, back to the patriotic cause, and that's going to actually re-energize the Patriots' morale because they're saying, wow, look at this guy. He was supposed to be this prominent battle commander. We trusted him. We put a lot of faith in him. And now here he is betraying us. So that actually fires up a lot of the patriotic cause. And George Washington himself feels pretty personally betrayed by this. And so that's really actually going to work to the disadvantage of Arnold and the Loyalists because all of a sudden the Patriots are more fired up now and saying, hey, look at this rat. We need to basically take him out and take it to the British. So ultimately a negative for the British and for Arnold, okay? So once the war's over, he's eventually kind of going to be exiled and he's going to leave for England and eventually die over there. So again, Benedict Arnold, you probably heard of him, considered the greatest traitor in American history. And again, why did he turn, to the other side? It ain't necessarily he totally believed in the British cause that much more. Really just came down to he was a selfish guy, wanted more money, wanted more fame, and he thought the British were going to give him that, even though ultimately didn't really work out for him. So Yorktown, though, this is the last major battle of the war. Takes place in late April of 1781. General Cornwallis, he had to secure Virginia before the French arrived. So Cornwallis is saying, listen, I need to get Virginia in my hands. He knows the French are going to be on their way, and so he's trying to take Virginia and trying to take this influential place before that happens. So Cornwallis and his men then link up with Benedict Arnold's men, the traitor, obviously, who commanded a unit of British troops, obviously. So about a month and a half later, in June of 1781, American General Mad Anthony Wayne, Mad was his nickname, arrived with his forces and end up overwhelming the British. And he's going to successfully prevent Cornwallis and his army from escaping by sea because they realize, we've lost this battle. We need to get out of here, get on the boats, and hightail it out of here. But they're going to prevent them from doing that. Okay. And so on September 28th, 1781, more Americans and French troops arrive and surround them, and they're just going to begin a full-fledged bombardment. They just start shooting the whole British area with cannons, and they're just kind of wanting to do that over and over again and beat them into submission. Finally, in kind of early to mid-October of 1781, Cornwallis realizes this is over and begins negotiations for a full-fledged surrender. So Cornwallis knows the jig is up, and he's going to start negotiating that. So October 19th, 1781, the kind of remaining 8,000 British soldiers there are going to march out of Yorktown and officially lay down their weapons. And again, there's going to be some smaller battles after this, but for the most part, Yorktown is the last major one. So basically, America has won by this point. We've beat Britain, and so now it's going to be all about kind of negotiating that surrender. Okay, you win. Do you want a horse? Oh, that would be great. Then you should have fought harder, loser. Surrender of Cornwallis. Okay. Last slide here. The Treaty of Paris, yet another Treaty of Paris. This one's going to really take place in 1783, but begins negotiating in 1782, where Parliament's going to vote to approve, beginning of peace negotiations. And Parliament and the Crown and even King George and certainly the people in Britain, they were ready to be done with this. They didn't think of this as that massive of a defeat for them. They're like, well, we've got enough problems as it is here in Europe. We'll just kind of cast away America, which again, America had been this important part of the kind of British identity for, about 150 odd years now by this point. But they're ready to get rid of America. Okay. So John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and John Jay are sent over to negotiate with the British on the part of the U.S. Okay. This Treaty of Paris is going to be signed on September 3rd, 1783. The United States is going to be officially recognized by Great Britain, the nation it just went to war with, as an independent nation. And this whole independent nation is going to have basically its borders set on the western border of the Mississippi River. So also behind closed doors, Florida is going to be given back to Spain. Again, Great Britain had taken control of Florida, but now it's going to go back to Spain, and basically because Spain had slightly aided the French and slightly aided America. And so they're going to give that back over to Spain. And France is going to get some colonies back in Africa. But the last British troops are going to leave America on November 24th, 1783. We won, right? We defeated the greatest power on the earth at this time. And now this young nation is on its own, where we have to now figure out what the future of America is. Especially, there's a lot of questions now. All that land we just picked up, right? That was what kind of America was before this, but these new United States now gain all of this territory with that Treaty of 1783. And some of the biggest questions moving forward is, are we going to, what are these territories going to be? Are they going to take the form of territories or this new notion of statehood, right? That's going to be a question. But again, the biggest thing is the United States has finally won this war, a war that many didn't think it could win, but through hard work and through dedication and through a lot of people risking a lot, the United States does successfully win this war. But a lot of questions remain. All right, we cast Britain out of here. What is our actual government going to look like? What function is it going to take? How are we going to divvy up power between all these different possible branches of government? That's all going to be questions we're going to be touching on next unit. But again, we won the war. And as I said, if we were kind of in class in a traditional way, I would focus a lot more on certain other things, but it is what it is. And so we're ending the war on this note. So as always, if you have any questions, please reach out to me and let me know. This is Mr. Huffman signing off. Take care.